shorten it up. Most of the research that you've, it looks like most of the research that you've done and most of the, and I know the study from Bates and Schmidt had to do with audiences that were relatively naive to misinformation, because it would be impossible to pre-bunk somebody if they had, were marinating in information for years. So the effectiveness of these techniques is, for the most part, for people who are just being presented with misinformation and then just having it debunked, or the other way around for pre-bunking. My question is this: out on the road talking to science deniers, I'm for the most part dealing with hardcore science deniers, people who have been marinating in disinformation for years and years. The only option you've got is debunking them. And the other thing that comes up is the question of whether these the flick techniques can be more effective face-to-face than online. I know that the Bates and Schmidt study was done online. I imagine that your studies, in the wild, when you're talking in person, it's across the Thanksgiving table, and cranky uncle is not naive to scientific disinformation. So I wonder if there's any information, any studies. Not working at all? Even
I think I got enough to be able to answer your question. So two things. Firstly, on the issue of deniers and pre-bunking kind of being ruled out, I think inoculation is actually a good analogy on another front, and that's I think polio is a good example, is a good analogy for science denial in general, in the sense that polio was an incurable disease that we still managed to almost completely eradicate through vaccination. It is possible to change a science denier's mind, but it's extremely unlikely, as you know from personal experience. And if our communication resources are limited, then I think that those limited resources are far better spent on the vast majority of the public who are not resistant to scientific evidence, and B, vulnerable to misinformation. And that's where inoculation can be, I think, most useful with the large undecided majority of the public, rather than the science deniers, that small percentage. The second thing you mentioned, I've already forgotten that, because you're talking about like face-to-face and conversation. Yeah, so one thing that we acknowledge that the game doesn't do yet is teach people how to have conversations with their cranky uncles. That's a completely different skill set. What the game does now is individual inoculation. The individual who's playing the game will learn how to spot those techniques. Having a conversation with a family member is a completely different issue, and it is something that we're hoping to bring into the game, like conversational techniques. We touch on them in the COVID communication handbook that Stefan Lundowski was a lead author on. But my hope is to gradually add another character to the game, like a cordial cousin, who can explain all the different ways that you can have a conversation with your cranky uncle. And then it becomes not just about inoculation, but about training people on how to go out and have those difficult conversations.
So I want to, the mics are back on. Can we get the picture of the speakers back on as well? I believe John Cook could hear that last question. I'd like to give him a chance to respond to that, and then we'll go to Stefano for the next question.
Yes, John.
John, can you hear us now?
Yes, I heard the tail end of that question, but my answer is not very satisfying. I confess social psychology is a bit of a weakness of mine, but I blame Stefan Lundowski, who's a cognitive scientist and very militant about me studying that area. I had some ideas for my PhD, which were more social psychology related, and he poured a lot of cold water on them.
Okay, so thank you, John. Now, in talking about technique of science denial, you use the acronym FLIC, which is very interesting. I never heard about that as a taxonomy. My question is, would you also add another letter to that acronym, namely to indicate teleopathy? The fact which is spreading more and more nowadays, the fact that in particular among the scientists, because they focus only one purpose, one telos, and they forget any other relations with the other, for instance, disciplines. And that is, of course, a major impediment to critical thinking, because to feed the critical thinking, you have to expose yourself not to those who occupy the same field of inquiry, but also to others. So don't you think that teleopathy today is a major, not a major, at least it's a factor determining what you said about the techniques of science denial? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general terms, I'm actually doing some very interesting work at the moment with Janet Swim, who's published a lot of research in this field, on looking at how, or mapping different cognitive biases to those techniques of science denial. And I think that speaks to what you're, or at least hints at what you're getting at, which is that there are, I think, fallacies in how we think, or different cognitive biases, and those are what can lead to fallacies. That's probably as far as I can go with it. I don't think I can get more specific on the particular issue you're bringing up.
Seema had the next question.
So Maguire was proposing all of this in the 60s, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on why we haven't deployed inoculation theory more in public health. We've used it a bit for smoking and I think teen pregnancy, but does it speak to some of the limitations, or can you just perhaps share your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, halfway through my PhD, I was presenting the research of that 2017 paper. And when I presented the research, I hadn't even heard of inoculation theory. And a professor in the audience said, "What you're doing sounds like inoculation." It turns out I rediscovered something that Maguire had researched in the 60s. So another PhD student who rediscovered something that smarter people had done decades earlier. I don't think that until the last few years, there's been much awareness of inoculation theory, particularly in the context of misinformation. And so it has really been around 2017 onwards that we've started to see inoculation being applied to the misinformation issue in earnest. And then from that, those initial research, we're starting to spin off into more nuanced ways of looking at it, such as logic-based versus fact-based versus source-based types of inoculation. So in a sense, it's a very old field that is only really growing in research popularity in the last couple of years. And then the logic-based approach was something Socrates was advocating many millennia ago. So we're kind of reinventing that now.
Max.
Hi, John. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for your talk. One of the things that's come up several times in these conversations throughout the last few days have been around leadership and influencers. So I guess I would love to hear a little bit more about your perspective and thoughts on that while we've got you here, is about, what if your cranky uncle is someone of influence? We could always revert to a US person to think of, but what about like Giorgio Chiellini, the defender for the Italian national team? What if he were your cranky uncle with great influence over the Italian publics? What are your thoughts on ways to address that effectively, to address his perspective effectively?
Yeah, that's a really big issue. Steve mentioned how just over the course of Trump's presidency, Republicans went from opposing to being a big supporter of him. And that really speaks to the power of a tribal leader to influence their tribe. And there's been a few US-based studies, at least, showing that elite cues or cues from political leaders is one of the biggest drivers of changes in public opinion about climate change. So what elites do has a big influence on public opinion. As to how to control it, I wish that I had good answers to that. There's some research, I think it's by Reifler and Nyan, that found that essentially putting a political price on misinformation, or at least making the potential price of being a misinformer more salient to politicians, can deter them from at least being more likely to publish or promote misinformation. They had a randomized field experiment where they sent letters to lawmakers, and half of them had a letter that emphasized the political price of misinforming, and the other half didn't. And the ones who received were less likely to promote misinformation. So I don't know how well that applies in this kind of more kind of period, but yeah, it's a shame that I've never seen any follow-up research for that kind of approach. It would be interesting to see whether that could be applied more.
Okay, we've got time for one more short question, but then we have to move directly in about 3 minutes to the general discussion to stay on time. John, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.